Okay, welcome to our Instagram friends and our Facebook, and of course all our friends on Zoom through Safra. Today's talk discussion is called Courage and the Power to Act. We're going to look at courage today, the ability to get things done, the ability to make a change, courage, the power to overcome natural or maybe unnatural powers that prevent us from making a change in our lives. And as we're going to see today, maybe more importantly, the lives of others. Now, I chose this title last week. It happens to be that a lot of the information I'll be sharing with you today comes from one of my great mentors and teachers, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, Zecher Tzadik Levracha, who unfortunately passed away this past Shabbat and has been mourned right through the Jewish world. It happens to be that the Hashgacha would have it that a lot of the Torah that I'll be sharing with you today, actually a lot of the Torah that I teach in general comes from this extraordinary, brilliant, intellectual, genius, and tzaddik. You hear the stories and the outpouring of love that this individual, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, Zecher Tzadik Levracha, engendered in people, and how beloved he was by all, by heads of state, royalty, and by many, many rabbis who looked upon him and his teaching for guidance, and by everyone else he could speak to. I mean, I was there a number of times when he spoke to high school children. I was part of a group, put together a talk where he spoke to college students. When he spoke to Birthright alumni, we had a talk at Fifth Avenue Synagogue. Actually, something very interesting. He went to speak at Fifth Avenue Synagogue in Manhattan, so called because it's on Fifth Avenue. And he stood there and said, "Now I understand the meaning of the expression, Saks Fifth Avenue." And he said that, and everyone burst out laughing, and that was it. He had everyone in the palm of his hands for the rest of his talk. He was an extremely brilliant individual. And again, it wasn't planned this way, but Hashem has his way. That let's discuss some of the ideas that he spoke about. And one of the things that he did speak about a lot was leadership. So we're going to talk about courage, the power to act. And we're going to do that through a very different prism. The idea of people influencing themselves and others in courageous acts. And what that means. It's also no coincidence that those who follow me on Facebook or Instagram, I spent the evening the other day with my rabbi's mother, Mrs. Frieda Berger. She lives in California, LA, and there was Sheva Brachot for her granddaughter, my rabbi's daughter, and I was asked to speak at the Sheva Brachot, which I did. Told a lot of great jokes, by the way. And then I sat down with this lady, a woman who went through the Holocaust, a woman with numbers on her arm. And she is, God bless her, maybe from 95 years old, you'd never know. She spoke to me for a long while. My wife and I, we received many blessings from her, an incredible woman. But there's one theme that came up again and again. And such a person is very courageous. But the way she spoke wasn't just about her own survival, but the rebuilding of her life after the war and her ability as a survivor of the Holocaust to help others. As far as I'm concerned, that's courage. And that's going to be our discussion today. Really a wonderful woman. And I think we're going to come back to a little bit later from a couple of things she told me of her life. By the way, she still works. She still cooks and delivers food, or has it picked up at 95 years old. Courage, power to act. To be a Jew, my friends, is to be willing to challenge the prevailing consensus and dare to be different. What it is to be Jew, what it is to be someone who is part of Klal Yisrael, the Jewish people, is to go against the grain, to not conform to pressure. And if you look back at our history, looking at the greatest heroes and heroines of Jewish history, they all have one thing in common. Whether it's Abraham, his wife Sarah, whether it is King David, Moses, Miriam, one of the most courageous women in Jewish history. We'll talk about her a little bit later as well. Right to the present day, Mrs. Frida Berger, a very courageous woman. They all have one thing in common. They dare to be different, and they go against the consensus. They go against societal pressure. When everyone is saying one thing, courage is the power to act and go against what everyone else is telling you to do. That is the different dimension of courage I want to look at today. There are many courageous people who do many courageous things, but I'm talking specifically today about one type of courage. The world says do it this way, and you know it's right. What that's based upon, we'll see. To go the opposite way. Abraham was the first such individual that we meet. Abraham was someone who had an ability, a courageous ability, to influence thousands of people. There are literally billions of people, Christians and Muslims and Jews, of course, and many others, who look upon this individual as their spiritual ancestor, if not genealogical. And they say that this is our leader. How did Avram get that power? There weren't miracles. If you look in the Torah, there's no miracle stories that Abraham performed. The Midrash talks of miracles that happened, but they're not recorded in the Torah. The miracles occur much later when the Jewish people leave Egypt and they need miracles in order to survive. But Abraham has no miracles. He's also not identified as a prophet of God in the Torah. Was he a prophet? Yeah, our tradition tells us that he was. But you don't see that in the Torah either. So no miracles and no prophecy. And he's not described as a charismatic individual. By the way, neither was Moses. And yet, he had the ability, the courage to, without an army, without a nation, without miracles, without prophecy, he had the ability, Abraham, to influence thousands of people in his day and millions, if not billions, throughout world history without power. What was the source of this? Where did this come from? How are we meant to understand this? And what does it mean to us as Jews or people in society today? You know, in Judaism, we talk about three power groups. There's three groups of leaders that we have in Jewish life, historically speaking. We have kings, the Melachim. We have priests, the Kohanim. And we have prophets, the Nevi'im. Kings, priests, prophets. Leadership pretty much came in one of those three forms, if you look throughout Jewish history. Where do the kings come from? That's inherited. If your father was a king, and your father's father was a king, and your father's father was a king, you were a melech. So that was limited to a unique and specific group of individuals who were the melachim. How about a priest? Can anyone become a priest? And we know the jokes of the guy who wanted to become a priest, and the rabbi said, you can't just become a priest, right? He goes, I'll pay for it. He says, it's not going to help. He's like, why do you want to become a priest anyway? He goes, because my father was a priest, and if your father's a Kohen, you're a Kohen. That's what makes you into Kohen. So kings, select group. Priests, select group. But the third ones, my friends, are the Nevi'im. And prophecy was not reserved to any one type of individual. Not by gender, not by age, not by pedigree, and not by location. It was open to all people at all times, even non-Jews. We know there were non-Jewish prophets as well, not limited just to the Jewish people. Of those three I just mentioned, two of them, if you look in Tanakh, look in scriptures, and look in Jewish history, two from those three, from kings, priests, and prophets, keep getting into fights. Like major battles. Like arguing with each other, actually so much that one group literally tried and in many cases was very successful in killing out, stabbing and killing out the other group. Who is that? It's the kings and the prophets. The Malachim and the Nevi'im are constantly fighting. You can't miss it. Why? Why these two groups? What is the secret to these groups? And what are we going to learn about our topic today? Well, the kings were actually the political and military leaders of the Jewish people. They were the ones who were deciding when to go to war, where to go to war, how many troops, how we fight. King David was a man of war. For that reason, he wasn't permitted by God to build the first temple. Had to be given to his son, Solomon. Shlomo HaMelech was able and had the merit to build the temple of Jerusalem because he was a man of peace. By the way, the wars of King David were wars that were mitzvah wars. At least Rashut was permitted to do it, to expand the territory of the land of Israel. What was the prophet's job? The prophets were visionaries. Men or women, young or old. And they had the ability to somehow, the responsibility to look into the future. Where is this actually going to take us? So the king is like, we got to fight right now. And the prophet's like, now's not a time to fight. Don't do it. God doesn't want that from you. Or the king would be like, I don't want to kill that person. And the prophet would be like, but you've got to kill him. From him is going to come Amalek. Agag needs to be killed. And the king is like, I don't think so. So these battles between the practical, pragmatic Melech, who is let's figure out what we need to do right now, and the visionary, the Navi, who's always about, let's not think about now. Mi Chacham, who is wise, Mi Shorat HaNolad. That is the person who looks into the future and sees the consequence of action. That causes a major battle. Abraham was someone who had to take on both roles. And he had to become the king of his people, not elected, not even appointed. He just created his own base of leadership, and he had to be a Navi. He had to figure out what the future holds. You see, leaders lead. That doesn't mean they don't follow, but what they follow is very different from what most people follow. That's the difference between a leader, a true leader, someone who doesn't just follow the masses, but someone who goes through life forging a path, a way. This is the courage of a true leader, which we all are. That's my point. I'm not talking about heads of state. Abraham was not a head of state. He created his own movement. They follow this inner voice, this call. They have a vision, not of what is, but what will be. And the idea of prophecy was it could be open to anyone at any time. And it overcomes the priest and even overcomes the king. The prophet is going to win. They just march to a different tune. This power of Abraham, this courageous power to go against everyone else, is described in one word. It's the Hebrew word for Hebrew. The Hebrew word for Hebrew is Ivri. What is Ivri? Ivri means the other side. The entire world is moving to a certain pace. In Abraham's day, it was idol worship. That was the main test of Abraham's day. Everyone was involved in Avodah Zarah. They were worshipping gods, and this did not go away. Abraham tried very, very hard and was greatly successful in selling monotheism, in pulling people away from Avodah Zarah and into ethical and moral monotheistic behavior, belief in the one true God. That's what Abraham's power was. He was able to do that. He did that by having the courage not to conform. If you remember, the first test of Abraham was to break away from his Aretz, from his Moladatcha, from his land, his birthplace, and from Beit Avicha, his father's house. Why is that? Why was that such an integral part of Abraham's journey to become the great Abraham? I'll tell you why. Because we are so influenced by where we grow up, the family, the people around us, the community, that if you want to create a change, you're going to have to go against and be an ivri. What's an ivri? La'avor. The entire world is saying one thing. That's what I was taught and drilled into my head. And now I've got to forge my own courageous path of leadership into the future. And to do that, you need to be an akshan. An akshan is someone who just goes against, is stubborn. You know, the Jewish people are described one way in the Bible. There's only one description that I've seen that describes all the Jewish people. We're not called the greatest business people. We're not called the greatest lawyers. We're not called the most charismatic. We are called the Am Keshei Oref, the stiff-necked people. You've had a stiff neck before? What's that like? You can't move around, right? Your neck is stuck. That means we are the stubborn people. By the way, that's a compliment and an insult. It's a compliment that when we're on the right path and we're leading that life of not conforming and going against the counterculture, because that's what the Jewish people are. We're the countercultures. We're the revolutionaries. If you look back in history, one thing you'll see among all Jewish people, religious, non-religious, wherever they are in the entire world, we're always going against. Sometimes rightly, sometimes wrongly. Sometimes you see a Jew on the right path, you can't pull him off. And then sometimes you see someone who's going off the wrong path, try to pull him back. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of work. You know, I've led many trips to Poland, to Auschwitz, Holocaust locations in Europe. And one thing you hear are stories of courage from Holocaust survivors. And I was lucky enough, honored to have with me a Holocaust survivor who joined us on 2, if not 3 of my trips, Label Zisman. Leo Zisman, some of you may know who he is. A truly courageous person. By the way, I just tell you a quick story, just to show you that his courage was real. We were walking around the camps, and you know that most of the bunks are closed off, right? They're just museum pieces. You can't go into them. They leave a few open so you can see inside the barracks where the Jews were living, which is basically planks of wood with straw on them, nothing more than that. So he said, Lawrence, do you want to see my bunk? I was like, well, what, Camp Moshava? Yeah, come and see where I lived. We walk over to his, because the numbers are still there. He says, I lived here for 3 years when I was in Auschwitz. He says, you want to see inside? I'm like, I'd like to, but there's a plank of wood on the nailing the hut shut. He's like, forget that. Took his hands, put his foot up against the door and ripped the wood off to give us access inside. I was like, Label, they're going to arrest us. What, are you crazy? He's like, they can't put me in here twice. That was his answer. His was courage. I want to share with you one courageous story of his, just to show you the nature of Avram Avinu's Am Keshei Oref, the Ivri, going against the grain. Label was able, you can read this in his book, I believe, to somehow smuggle tefillin into the camps. And he showed us where he was lined up at the door, that famous entranceway into Auschwitz. And he lined up, and you were allowed to keep your boots on. They took away all your possessions, but your boots were there. And the boots, he said, were big boots. And he was able to stuff his tefillin that were given to him by his father and mother both died in the Holocaust. Another story, not for now, a fascinating story in and of itself. And he stuffed the tefillin into his boot. And he used to put tefillin on in the camps, in Auschwitz. Can you imagine that? Like, we have trouble getting out of bed to go to synagogue around the corner. And he was able to put tefillin on in the camp. And not only that, he used to lend the tefillin to other people who wanted them. And there were little windows at the top of the barracks, he showed me. And they used to jump up and throw tefillin out. And once he was caught by a capo, who were sometimes Jews or non-Jews, who saw him doing this and said, what are you doing? He said nothing. He was scared he'd get caught and his tefillin, his precious tefillin, would get confiscated. And he would not give up his tefillin. And the capo said, I'm going to beat you to the inch. And he says, I don't care. I have nothing to give you. And he said they put him over. There's a middle section in the barrack, and they put him over it, and they took out a paddle, and he beat him so hard They had to sleep on his stomach for 3 weeks, so painful that he became unconscious, but he never gave it up. Where does this come from? Am Kishay Oref. That's courage. That's an akshan, the counterculture. Everyone was saying, just give it to him, give it to him. He's like, no, I'm not going to do it. That comes from the seed of Avraham Avinu. Am Kishay Oref. We are the counterculture. We do what isn't always popular. It's interesting that Abraham in Bereshit, Yudchet, Yutet 18:19 is told by God, teach your children and your household after you to follow the way of the Lord by doing what is right and just. So Rabbi Sachs points out, he wasn't told to do things that are popular. Abraham was told to do what's right and just. Don't follow the masses. There are times when you're going to have to figure out, using the power that's inherent in us, to do the right thing and not to follow the masses. To be a Jew is the person who is courageous, is my point, to challenge the prevailing consensus. What happens is that as societies and cultures and communities, we slip into the prevailing nationalism around us, right? It was nationalism which led us into the First World War, into the Second. What is nationalism? People, not pride. You should all have pride in your country and your nation. What we're saying over here is that nationalism, which is that it is only us and we far exceed everybody else, right? This is what Nazi Germany, this is what's happening in North Korea, this is what's happening in Iran today. You'll notice they have something in common. These are people who are trying to break and bringing people in, and most people in the country just go with it, right? You hear rarely of individuals who go against this counterculture. That's courage is going against the prevailing customs. Because deep down, you know they're wrong and you need to do something that is right. Okay? And by the way, there were many symbols of power through history. The Egyptians had Ra, right? The Baal for the Canaanites, Chomesh for the Moabites, Zeus for the Greeks. Today we have terrorists with bombs. That's the idol worship of today. Those are the nationalistic societies, the dictatorships that many people are sucked into, just follow. I want to just read for you. I really, this is unbelievable. I didn't plan for this to happen, obviously. Right? I chose this topic, and it's a topic that Rabbi Sachs has spoken about. I want to just read his words to you, right? As we're still in the days after his passing. And he said like this, that is the conclusion, he says, that I've reached after a lifetime of studying our sacred texts. It is about how a nation can be formed on the basis of shared commitment and collective responsibility. That's courage, my friends. Sharing other people, taking responsibility. Kol Yisrael arevim zeh b'zeh. Everyone is responsible for other people and showing commitment to it. It is about how to construct a society that honors the human person as the image and likeness of God. I'm not better than anyone else. We are all made b'tselem Elokim. It is about a vision. Courage is the vision, never fully realized, but never abandoned. You're never there. You never have a prophet who was there. Moshe Rabbeinu never fully reached Israel. Abraham never fully inherited the land in his lifetime. No one ever fully gets what they want. Of a world based on justice and compassion in which, as Isaiah the prophet says, chapter 11, verse 9, they will neither harm nor destroy. On all my holy mountain, for the earth will be filled with knowledge of God as the waters cover the sea. That's a vision, of course, of the coming Mashiach. You know, since this is the week of women, Sarah Imenu, I spoke about last night, those who didn't catch the class, we spoke about how Sarah and Esther were two great queens of Jewish history, the queen of time and the queen of space, Sarah and Esther. I want to talk about a third great Jewish woman who unfortunately gets overlooked, but probably one of the greatest visionaries in world history, and that is Miriam. Without a Miriam, Moses' older sister, there would be no Moshe Rabbeinu. And we know that Paro was killing children. And so Miriam's parents, Amram and Yocheved, decided to split up, So we can't stay married. We can have no more children. Any children that come are going to be killed. Miriam persuaded her parents to stay together, saying, you're worse than Pharaoh. That's courage. Talk to your parents that way. Pharaoh just wants to kill the boys. You're not having children. You're killing the boys and the girls. And they said, you're right. And they remained married. And they, of course, had Moshe Rabbeinu. And then Miriam took a responsibility. Courage, responsibility. Everyone was refused to have kids. And Miriam said, have children. And of course, she saved her younger brother Moshe by putting him in the bulrushes. Found by Bati, the daughter of Pharaoh. And Moses became the great leader that we know. It doesn't stop there, though. Listen to this amazing aspect. Listen to the visionary power of a great female prophetess. When the Jewish people left Egypt, the Torah tells us, they left armed. Chamushim yalu. They left armed with weapons, ready to fight. They realized, hey, the Egyptians hate us. The rest of the world's going to hate us as well. As we walk through the Midbar, on our way to Eretz Yisrael, it's going to take us a few weeks. It took 40 years, but it thought it'd be a few weeks. We're going to get attacked. So they prepared, says Rashi, Chamushim yalu, by arming themselves with weapons. But the Jewish women didn't do that. Miriam, the Torah itself goes out of there to tell us, brought musical instruments. So there are all the men coming out with swords and spears and shields or whatever weapons they were able to collect from the Egyptians and from their chariots. And Miriam is coming out with a tambourine, guitar, harp, whatever it was. Why? So Rashi comments as something unbelievable. You see, the men were visionaries. They were prepared for the battle that was about to come. But the Jewish woman has a greater insight of prophecy. And that was Miachacha Mirona Nola. She saw that they were going to fight wars. She had faith in God that they were going to win the wars. And she took musical instruments so that when they would win these wars, they would be able to celebrate and pray with music and thank God for the victory. That is a visionary, and that's courage. Courage isn't always going to war. Courage is, I know we're going to win. I have faith in God, and the winning is going to lead to a great celebration. So the men were up in front, but the women were far in front of them as well. Miriam was one of the greatest visionaries in Jewish history. Without her, we wouldn't have a Moshe Rabbeinu, and without her, we wouldn't have survived the Egyptian Golus, because we know that in the merit of the great Jewish women, says the Gemara, Nigalim, we were redeemed. It was the Nashim Tzidkaniot, the great courageous women. Because in Egypt, the men were not willing to have sexual relations in order to bring children forth. And if they wanted to, they were so tired after hours and hours of back-breaking work. And we know that the women enticed the men after work into the orchards under the apple tree and said, we've got to keep the Jewish people going. There will be a redemption. And then what are you talking about? We're being beaten and killed and hit. We will be redeemed. The time will come. And so the Jewish women, in their merit, kept new children coming out against sometimes the ability of the men in order to keep the Jewish people going. That, my friends, is the power of the holy, courageous Jewish woman. Esther also had that power. Her mission was challenging and difficult, but she did it. She came out and she went against the norm because the rest of the Jewish people went to the feast, and Mordechai and Esther said, no, this is not right. Counterculture, Am Kashay Oref, going against the prevalent norm. Even sometimes when the entire Jewish people are doing it. Mordechai refused to eat at the feast of Achashverosh. And because of that, Haman said, let's wipe them out. Let's kill them all. They're not like us. And imagine the Jewish people, they're like Mordechai. Just turn up to the feast. Don't eat anything. Turn up, smile at the king, and walk out. He says, I refuse. And he refused to bow down to Haman. Everyone else was bowing down to Haman. And Mordechai said, no, that's not what I do. I am not from the bowers. And you can imagine how upset the Jews were. He wants to kill us because of you, Mordechai. If you look at the story, the only person who wouldn't bow down to Haman was Mordechai. So I'm sure everyone was saying to him, and because of that one decision of Mordechai, Haman says, I'm going to kill you. Actually, I'm going to kill all the rabbis. Actually, I'm going to kill all the Jewish people. Not only here in Persia, but for the entire world. That, my friends, is the courage of Mordechai. Going against, where did he get that from? From his great-great-great-grandfather? Abraham. Avraham Avinu taught him and gave him the power to overcome. You know, dead fish. If you've ever seen a dead fish in the water, it just moves along with the tide. It moves along with the water. Live fish, you know a fish is alive in the water when it goes against the stream. When it goes back, like a salmon, back to where I came from. I got to figure out who I am as a Jew, what my tradition tells me, go back to my original source, and that's where I'm going to lead myself. There is a pressure to conform, and we don't even, this is the Avodah Zarah. It takes a tremendous courage to resist that pressure. Abraham had to leave his home. It was an extremely difficult thing to do. He was extremely successful in Haran. He was ostensibly wealthy, and he had family, and he had thousands of followers, and Hashem said, you got to break it. You got to go against. And the movement of Abraham from Haran, outside of Israel, to Israel, and the movement of the Jewish people from Egypt into a Midbar desert, then Israel makes no sense. It's courage because nobody else was doing it. No one was leaving Egypt to go into an empty desert. That's insane. Egypt was the America of its day, right? People are fighting to get into America, right? Most of them are not leaving to third world war-ridden countries unless they're trying to make a difference. Okay, these are the two great journeys of Jewish history. The Jewish people from Egypt to a desert to Israel. And where do they learn? Where do they get the courage to do that from? From their great-great-great-great-grandfather and grandmother Sarah, who left Ur Kasdim and Haran, Iraq, and then Haran, Mesopotamia, and then make their way into the land of Israel. And by the way, when they got there, it didn't even make sense because there was a famine and they had to leave and go to Egypt. So even when you think you've won the battle, it doesn't even end over there. There was a very famous science experiment performed by an individual called Solomon Asch, which Rabbi Sachs brings down. And he assembled, and you've seen, I'm sure, many similar experiments, group of people, asked them a series of simple cognitive questions. He gave them a card with different lines on. And he says, is this line longer than this line? And there was a group. Everyone was in on the charade, except one person. So initially they're like, no, that line is longer than that one. And that line is longer than that one. But eventually everyone started to turn against the one individual. Like, no. This line, which was definitely shorter, I mean, you could just see it. This one's longer than the other one. And everyone who was in on the social experiment said, yeah, for sure. That one over there is longer, although it was an inch shorter than the others. And this person initially fought against it, but eventually just gave in, just went with the flow, like the dead fish. Go with the flow. Jewish people, by our nature, go against it. Not always rightly, we make big mistakes. Most of the isms in Jewish history have come from Jewish people. And many of them have worked out very, very badly for us and the world as well. So you've got to know what we are as a people, what we represent. But many people go through this. We just kind of go through it. This is the Avodah Zarah, the idol worship of our day. We invest ourselves in these people and we think they are our salvation. And Hashem always, eventually, pulls the rug and says, they are not your salvation. It's not going to come from them. It's going to come from a better, higher place. But you're going to have to show me you're willing to take the first step in order to fight it off. And we'll finish with what Rabbi Sachs, Zecher Tzaddik Livracha, finished with. The poet Robert Frost, in his words, as he put it, 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled. And that made all the difference. The history of the Jewish people, the history of leadership, the history of power to have courage doesn't just come from people who flex their muscles, who start wars. For us, courage comes from personal control and from going against the prevalent culture that is dragging everyone else. Everyone says Avodah Zarah, and the Jewish people are the Ivriim. We are Avor. We're on the other side. That is genetically, spiritually downloaded into our DNA. And that's why you'll see so many Jewish people taking this divergent path, trying to figure out the road less traveled. Because that, my friends, is the derech of the Jewish people. I've overrun my time. Thank you all so much for joining me. And God willing, we'll pick this up next week with more ideas into self-improvement. Thank you. Have a great and wonderful, successful week.